Я не понимаю. Мать что, ни с кем не дружила, не общалась? Спасибо, что собрались разделить с нами наше горе. Я потеряла. У тебя какой размер?
42-й. Тетя Тань, ну...
Ну и как там наша милашка-племяшка?
Да.
It's breathtaking, isn't it? I want you to stay here in this moment. I'm flying, Jack. I'm flying.
I'll never let go.
Do you think it'll look as good in person?
We can't keep running from the past.
Will you marry me?
Look at this beautiful detail.
You always knew how to make me feel cherished.
I never knew stillness could feel so heavy.
I'll never let go. Hold on to me, Jack.
I'm not letting go. This moment feels timeless.
This moment feels timeless.
We'll make it through this.
Ja, er zijn er twee in welk sense. I'm a little bit. 'Cause 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 'cause
It's beautiful, isn't it?
This moment feels so timeless.
It's a promise, Jack.
We must not miss the dance.
I'll never let go. Hold on to me, Jack.
I'm not letting go.
This moment feels timeless.
This moment feels timeless.
I'm flying.
I'll never let go.
Few films have occupied the cultural imagination the way Titanic has. Nearly 3 decades after its release, it remains a fixture of conversation, a touchstone for arguments about romance and realism, and a permanent entry in the short list of movies that people describe not as something they watched, but as something they experienced. That distinction matters. A film can be popular without being formative. It can earn money without leaving a mark on how people think about cinema itself. Titanic did both, and the reasons why deserve more careful examination than the film usually receives. Part of the challenge in writing seriously about Titanic is that it has become so familiar that familiarity itself gets mistaken for simplicity. The image of 2 lovers at the bow of a ship, arms outstretched, has been reproduced, parodied, and referenced so many times that it risks becoming a punchline before it can be understood as an image with actual craft behind it. The film's popularity has, paradoxically, made it harder to see clearly. To engage with Titanic seriously requires setting aside the cultural residue that has built up around it and looking again at what the film is actually doing, scene by scene, choice by choice, and why those choices produced the response they did. There is also a temptation to treat Titanic as a phenomenon rather than a work of authorship, to discuss box office records and merchandising and the Celine Dion single as though these things explain the film, when in fact they are downstream effects of decisions made by a director, a crew, and a cast working through a genuinely difficult set of creative problems. How do you tell an intimate love story inside an event whose ending every audience member already knows? How do you make a 3-hour film feel urgent when its final act is, structurally, a disaster that cannot be averted? How do you honor the historical dead without turning them into scenery for a romance? These are the questions this essay is interested in, and they are questions about craft, not marketing. Titanic is often discussed as though it belongs to a single genre. The romance, the disaster movie, the historical epic. But its endurance owes something to the fact that it refuses to sit comfortably in any one of these categories. It borrows the emotional architecture of a tragic romance, the structural clock of a disaster film, and the texture of a historical reconstruction, and it fuses them into something that behaves like all 3 at once without fully belonging to any of them. This hybrid quality is one reason the film continues to attract new viewers decades after its release. It offers different things to different audiences, and it rewards rewatching because no single viewing exhausts what it contains. It is also worth acknowledging, at the outset, why a film released in 1997 continues to merit this kind of sustained critical attention rather than being left to nostalgia. Cinema produces very few works that manage to be simultaneously a technical landmark, a historical document of sorts, and a genuinely moving personal drama. Most films that achieve one of these distinctions do not achieve the other 2. A technically groundbreaking film is often thin on character, and an emotionally powerful drama is often modest in scale and ambition. Titanic's claim on serious critical attention rests on having attempted, and largely succeeded at, all 3 simultaneously, and understanding how it did so tells us something useful, not just about this one film, but about the underlying mechanics of what makes large-scale cinematic storytelling work. This essay approaches Titanic as a serious object of film criticism and cultural analysis. It examines the historical world the film reconstructs, the ambitions and constraints that shaped James Cameron's approach, the mechanics of its storytelling, the psychology of its central characters, the thematic material the film returns to again and again, its visual and symbolic language, its technical achievements, its relationship to the historical record, the emotional mechanisms that account for its impact, and the cultural legacy it has generated. Along the way, it engages honestly with the film's criticisms and the debates that have followed it into the 21st century. The goal is not to relitigate whether Titanic deserved its awards or its box office, but to understand, with some rigor, why a film about a sinking ship became one of the defining cinematic experiences of its era, and why, against the odds of changing tastes and shifting technology, it has not let go of the audience's imagination. 2. Historical background. The real RMS Titanic. RMS Titanic was a British ocean liner built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast for the White Star Line, one of several shipping companies competing for dominance on the transatlantic passenger route in the early 20th century. At the time of her construction, Titanic and her sister ships were among the largest moving objects ever built by human beings, a fact that mattered enormously to a culture that had come to associate scale with progress. She departed Southampton, England, on her maiden voyage on April 10, 1912, bound for New York City, with stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, to take on additional passengers. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, after striking an iceberg in the North Atlantic the previous night, Titanic sank, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,500 people. It remains one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history and, because of the ship's reputation and the prominence of many of her passengers, one of the most extensively documented. The disaster prompted major reforms in maritime safety regulation, including new requirements for lifeboat capacity, wireless communication procedures, and iceberg patrols in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, reforms whose effects are still felt in maritime law today. Edwardian society and class divisions. Titanic sailed during the Edwardian era, a period named for King Edward VII of the United Kingdom that is often remembered, somewhat nostalgically, as a final flowering of aristocratic elegance before the First World War reshaped European society. It was also a period of stark and rigidly enforced class stratification. Passenger ships of the era physically encoded this stratification into their architecture. First-class accommodations offered luxury comparable to the finest hotels of the period, while third-class, or steerage, passengers, many of them emigrants seeking new lives in North America, were housed in far more modest quarters, often below decks and separated from the upper classes by both distance and, in some configurations, by locked gates intended to comply with immigration inspection requirements. This architecture of separation was not incidental to the disaster. It shaped who survived and who did not. Historical analysis of the sinking has consistently shown that survival rates correlated strongly with class, with first-class passengers, and women and children within first and second class in particular, surviving at significantly higher rates than third-class passengers and adult men across all classes. The women and children first protocol was applied unevenly across the ship, and structural obstacles, distance from boat decks, unfamiliarity with the ship's layout, and in some cases restricted access, made the practical experience of the disaster very different depending on which part of the ship a passenger called home for the voyage. Maritime context and the disaster's significance. The sinking of Titanic did not occur in isolation. It took place at a moment when technological confidence, in engineering, in industrial capacity, in the ability of human ingenuity to master nature, was near its cultural peak. The ship had been popularly described, though this framing was amplified after the fact more than it was a settled claim at the time, as effectively unsinkable, a reputation built from her double-bottomed hull and 16 watertight compartments. The disaster's cultural shock derived in large part from the collision between this confidence and the brutal demonstration of its limits. A ship built to represent the triumph of modern engineering was destroyed by a piece of ice that predated human civilization, and it happened not through some dramatic, unforeseeable catastrophe, but through a series of avoidable errors. Insufficient lifeboats, warnings not fully heeded, and a speed maintained through a known ice field. Regulatory legacy. The disaster's regulatory aftermath is worth dwelling on briefly, because it clarifies why the event carried significance beyond individual tragedy. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, first adopted in 1914 in direct response to the disaster, established requirements that ships carry sufficient lifeboats for all aboard, mandated continuous wireless radio watch to prevent the kind of missed or delayed distress communication that hampered rescue efforts on the night of the sinking, and established the International Ice Patrol to monitor iceberg activity in North Atlantic shipping lanes. These reforms fundamentally altered maritime safety practice going forward and represent one of the clearest cases in modern history of a single disaster directly reshaping international regulatory standards. This regulatory legacy underscores that the disaster's significance was never purely symbolic or literary. It produced concrete, lasting institutional change, which is part of why the event retained such enduring weight in the public imagination well before Cameron's film revived broader popular interest in it. This is the historical terrain James Cameron's film inherits, and understanding it is essential to understanding the film's ambitions. Titanic is not simply a backdrop for a love story. It is a specific historical event freighted with a century of meaning about class, hubris, technology, and mortality. The film's decision to build its fictional romance inside this specific historical frame, rather than inventing a fictional ship or a more generic maritime disaster, is itself a significant creative choice, because it commits the filmmakers to engaging with real historical stakes rather than purely invented ones. Immigration and the promise of America. A significant proportion of Titanic's third-class passengers were emigrants, many from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Eastern and Southern Europe, traveling to the United States and Canada in search of economic opportunity unavailable to them at home. This context matters to any serious reading of the film, because it means the third-class passengers were not simply poor in a static, generalized sense. They were, for the most part, people actively pursuing a specific and hopeful life transition, having in many cases spent significant savings on their passage in pursuit of a fundamentally different future. The disaster's disproportionate toll on this population carries a particular historical weight as a result. It was not merely the deaths of poor passengers in the abstract, but the foreclosure of thousands of individually pursued, hopeful new beginnings, a dimension the film gestures toward through its third-class characters' expressed excitement about arriving in America, even as it necessarily focuses its detailed characterization on a small handful of individuals within that much larger group. How history shaped the film. Cameron's film uses the ship's class architecture as the organizing structural principle of its love story. The romance between Jack Dawson, a penniless artist traveling third class, and Rose DeWitt Bukater, a young woman of the declining aristocracy traveling first class, is only possible, dramatically, because of the rigid social boundaries the ship physically enforces. Their relationship becomes a form of trespass, moving between decks, between social worlds, and the film uses the ship's real, documented class geography as the terrain on which that trespass plays out. This is one of the more sophisticated aspects of the film's design. It takes a genuine historical structure and repurposes it as dramatic architecture, so that the history is not simply illustrated but actively used to generate the story's central tension. The disaster's well-documented timeline, the iceberg warnings, the collision, the initial disbelief, the slow realization of the ship's fate, the loading of lifeboats, the band, the final plunge, also gives the film's back half its structure. Because the broad strokes of what happened that night are historically established, Cameron was working within a framework that audiences already knew, at least in outline, before they entered the theater. That knowledge becomes a storytelling tool in itself, a subject this essay returns to in the section on narrative structure. 3. James Cameron's vision. Research and historical commitment. James Cameron approached Titanic less like a conventional Hollywood director, and more like an obsessive investigator determined to reconstruct a lost world with forensic precision. He read extensively on the disaster, consulted with maritime historians, and studied surviving deck plans, photographs, and passenger accounts. Perhaps most distinctively, Cameron undertook a series of deep-sea dives to the actual wreck site, using Russian-operated submersibles to film the ship's remains directly, a level of first-hand engagement almost unheard of for a dramatic feature film. Footage from these dives appears in the film's opening sequence, grounding the fictional narrative in documentary reality before the story proper begins. This commitment to research was not simply a matter of authenticity for its own sake. Cameron has spoken about wanting the ship itself to function as a character, and that ambition required the physical world of the film to be built with enough accuracy that audiences would trust it implicitly, freeing them to invest emotionally in the fictional story unfolding within it. If the ship felt fake, the argument goes, the emotions would feel fake too. Historical accuracy, in this sense, was in service of emotional believability rather than an end in itself. The wreck footage as creative foundation. Cameron's decision to begin the film with actual footage of the wreck, filmed during his own expeditions to the site, is worth considering as more than a striking visual opener. It establishes, before the audience meets a single fictional character, that the story to follow is anchored in a real, physically verifiable historical event whose material remains still exist on the ocean floor. This choice sets a tone of documentary seriousness that carries through the entire film, priming audiences to receive the subsequent romance not as a story invented in isolation from history, but as one explicitly built on top of, and answerable to, a real and still present historical site. The emotional effect of returning to this wreck footage at the film's structural hinge points, beginning and end, reinforces the film's larger thematic interest in the relationship between the physical remains of the past and the living memory that gives those remains their true meaning. Production planning and physical reconstruction. To achieve the visual and physical authenticity he wanted, Cameron oversaw the construction of a near full-scale exterior replica of Titanic at a purpose-built studio facility in Baja California, Mexico, alongside a massive water tank system that allowed for controlled flooding and sinking sequences. Interiors were reconstructed with close attention to the original ship's documented layouts, from the grand staircase to the first-class dining saloon, often based on surviving blueprints and photographs from Harland and Wolff and the White Star Line. This approach reflected a broader philosophy that favored building physical, practical environments wherever feasible, reserving computer-generated imagery for elements that could not be achieved practically. Wide shots of the full ship, crowds of passengers in long shots, and the physical destruction of the vessel at a scale no practical set could survive. The balance between practical construction and digital effects is one of the film's defining technical achievements, discussed at greater length in the filmmaking section of this essay. Creative goals. Marrying scale and intimacy. Cameron's stated ambition was to make a film that operated on two scales simultaneously, the epic scale of a historical catastrophe and the intimate scale of a personal love story. This was, by his own account and by the account of many involved in the production, an enormously difficult balancing act. A film that leaned too heavily into spectacle risked reducing the human tragedy to visual effects. A film that leaned too heavily into romance risked trivializing the historical deaths of real people. Cameron's solution was structural. Build the entire film as a frame narrative told through the memory of an elderly survivor, so that the epic disaster is always filtered through, and subordinated to, a single remembered human experience. Technical innovation. Titanic's production pushed visual effects technology in ways that had lasting influence on the film industry. The digital water simulation techniques developed for the film, the use of motion-controlled miniatures in combination with full-scale sets, and the compositing work required to blend live-action performers with digital crowds and digital ship exteriors were, at the time, at the frontier of what was technically possible. Cameron's visual effects house, Digital Domain, developed new tools specifically to solve problems the production presented, particularly around simulating the physical behavior of water at a believable scale and integrating digital human figures into wide shots of the sinking. Casting philosophy. Cameron's approach to casting his two leads reflected the same balancing act that governed his broader creative goals. Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet were, at the time of casting, respected but not yet fully established as major box office draws, a choice that allowed the characters of Jack and Rose to feel less like pre-existing star personas being deployed into a historical setting and more like specific, believable individuals native to that setting. This casting logic mirrors a broader principle evident throughout the production, prioritizing believability and emotional specificity over the immediate commercial security that bigger, more established names might have offered. It is a choice that paid off substantially once the film's success made both actors into major stars in their own right, but it reflects a genuine creative risk taken at the time, consistent with Cameron's broader willingness to prioritize the integrity of the film's world over safer, more conventional production choices. Filmmaking challenges. The production of Titanic was famously difficult, marked by a long and costly shoot, technical setbacks, and a budget that made it, at the time of release, the most expensive film ever produced. These difficulties were widely reported in the press before the film's release, generating skepticism about whether the film could possibly recoup its costs. That skepticism forms an important part of the film's reception history. Titanic arrived in theaters trailed by predictions of failure, which makes its subsequent success, critical, commercial, and cultural, a more striking story than it might otherwise be. The gap between pre-release expectation and post-release reception is itself a subject worth returning to when considering how the film was received and remembered. 4. Storytelling analysis. The frame narrative and its function. One of the most consequential structural decisions in Titanic is one audiences often take for granted. The film is not told chronologically from 1912 forward. It begins in the present day, with treasure hunter Brock Lovett searching the wreck for a legendary diamond, and pivots into its historical narrative only when a 101-year-old survivor, Rose, contacts the expedition and offers to tell her story. Everything that follows is framed as her memory. This choice does several kinds of narrative work at once. First, it solves the problem of dramatic irony that any Titanic story must confront. The audience knows the ship will sink before the film even begins. Rather than trying to hide this outcome, Cameron builds the entire film around it, using the frame narrative to remind the audience, at regular intervals, that a survivor exists and is telling this story from a position of having lived through it. This transforms suspense about whether disaster will strike into a different and arguably richer kind of tension. Suspense about who will survive, how, and at what cost. Second, the frame narrative establishes Rose as the story's true protagonist and narrator, which matters because it means the film we watch is explicitly subjective, a memory, curated and emotionally weighted, rather than an objective historical record. This framing gives Cameron license to shape the story around emotional truth rather than strict documentary neutrality, while still maintaining the physical accuracy of the setting, pacing, and the architecture of a 3-hour film. Titanic's roughly 3-hour runtime is often cited as evidence of indulgence, but the pacing reflects a deliberate structural logic. The film's first half is unhurried by design, spending considerable time establishing the ship's physical geography, its social stratifications, and the psychological states of its central characters before any hint of disaster appears. This slower first movement is not filler. It is the foundation that makes the second half's velocity meaningful. Audiences cannot feel the loss of a world unless they have first been made to understand and inhabit that world. The shift in pacing after the iceberg collision is stark and intentional. Scenes shorten. Cross-cutting between different decks and different characters accelerates. The camera itself becomes more mobile and less composed, trading the elegant, often symmetrical framing of the first half for a more chaotic, handheld-influenced visual language once the ship begins its final descent. This formal shift mirrors the narrative's collapse from order into chaos, giving the audience a felt, physical sense of disintegration that complements the plot's events rather than merely illustrating them. Dramatic tension in a story with a known outcome. Because the ending is historically fixed, Titanic cannot rely on outcome-based suspense in the way a conventional thriller might. Instead, the film generates tension through smaller, localized uncertainties nested inside the larger, certain catastrophe. Will Jack and Rose find each other in time? Will Rose choose to stay or attempt escape? Which of the historically documented figures will the audience see making their final choices? And how will the film render those choices? This layered approach to suspense, certain macro outcome, uncertain micro outcomes, is one reason the film's back half remains gripping on repeat viewings even after the audience has fully internalized every plot beat. The tension is not about what happens, but about how it happens and who is swept up in it. Cross-cutting and the sense of simultaneity. One of the storytelling techniques Titanic relies on most heavily during its disaster sequence is cross-cutting between multiple, simultaneous strands of action occurring in different parts of the ship. Officers on the bridge assessing the damage, engineers fighting to keep pumps running, the wireless room sending distress calls, stewards attempting to wake and organize passengers, and, at the center of it all, Jack and Rose navigating their own personal crisis. This technique allows the film to convey the disaster's scale, the fact that it was happening to over 2,000 people simultaneously, not merely to its two protagonists, without abandoning its central romance to do so. The rhythm of this cross-cutting accelerates as the disaster progresses, with shots growing shorter and transitions growing more abrupt, formally enacting the collapsing time frame the characters themselves are experiencing. This technique is a familiar tool of disaster and war filmmaking generally, but Titanic's particular skill lies in never losing its emotional through-line to Jack and Rose, even while cutting away to a dozen other, historically grounded strands of action, ensuring that the audience's investment in the central characters is sustained even during the sequences most focused on collective spectacle. Perspective and emotional selection. Because the narrative is filtered through Rose's memory, the film has considerable freedom in what it chooses to dramatize and what it leaves in the margins. Entire categories of the disaster's historical complexity, the technical minutiae of the ship's design flaws, the full scope of the inquiry that followed, the experiences of hundreds of passengers whose stories are equally tragic but structurally absent from this particular narrative, are compressed or omitted, not out of carelessness but because Rose's memory, as a narrative device, is necessarily selective. This is worth noting critically. The film is not attempting to be a comprehensive historical account. It is attempting to be a coherent, emotionally legible story built from one imagined survivor's recollection of a real event, and its narrative choices should be evaluated on those terms. Foreshadowing as structural glue. Because the audience already knows the ship will sink, Titanic is free to foreshadow its own catastrophe openly rather than concealing it, and the film uses this freedom deliberately. Early dialogue about the ship's lifeboat capacity, Andrews's quiet acknowledgement of the ship's design compromises, and visual cues like the iceberg warnings received and set aside all function not as mystery-building clues in the conventional sense. There is no mystery to solve, but as a slow tightening of dramatic irony. The audience watches characters make ordinary, unremarkable choices, fully aware of a context those characters do not yet have, and this asymmetry of knowledge is one of the film's most consistent sources of tension throughout its first half. It is a technique borrowed less from the thriller tradition, where foreshadowing usually builds toward a reveal, than from classical tragedy, where the audience's foreknowledge of catastrophe is itself part of the intended aesthetic experience. The present-day frame as emotional anchor. The scenes set aboard Brock Lovett's research vessel are sometimes dismissed as the film's least essential material, functioning purely as a framing device to justify the flashback structure. This underestimates their narrative function. The present-day sequences establish, before the historical narrative even begins, that someone survived, which recalibrates the entire subsequent viewing experience away from, will she live, toward, how did she live, and what did it cost her? They also introduce the film's material versus emotional value theme discussed in the symbolism section, contrasting Lovett's initial focus on the diamond's monetary worth with Rose's insistence on the story's human worth. Lovett's own arc, in which his purely commercial interest in the wreck gives way to genuine emotional investment in Rose's story, functions as a proxy for the audience's own expected journey through the film, arriving out of curiosity about a famous disaster, leaving with an emotional attachment to specific human lives. Objects as narrative evidence. The film's present-day frame narrative is structured, in part, as an investigation, with Lovett's expedition initially motivated by the search for the heart of the ocean diamond, believed lost with the ship. This investigative framing gives the film a secondary structural engine beyond pure memory. Physical objects recovered from the wreck, including a drawing Rose herself made decades earlier, function as evidence that authenticates her account and draws the present-day characters and the audience deeper into her story. This use of material objects as a bridge between the historical narrative and the present-day frame reinforces the film's thematic interest, discussed in the symbolism and theme sections, in the relationship between physical remains and living memory, while also providing a satisfying structural mechanism for transitioning between the film's two timelines without relying purely on voice-over narration to carry that weight. Why the storytelling resonates. The combination of a known outcome, a deliberately paced first act, an accelerating second act, and a subjective narrative frame produces a story that audiences experience less as what happens next, and more as how deeply will I feel this. That shift, from plot-driven curiosity to emotionally driven immersion, is a large part of why Titanic storytelling continues to work even for audiences who already know every beat before the film starts. The mechanics of the story are built to reward emotional attention rather than surprise, which is precisely the quality that makes the film rewatchable in a way that many surprise-dependent narratives are not. 5. Character analysis. Rose DeWitt Bukater. Rose functions as both the film's protagonist and its narrating consciousness, and her arc is built around a specific psychological conflict. The tension between an externally imposed identity and an internal sense of self she has not yet been permitted to express. At the film's opening, Rose is defined almost entirely by her social role, the daughter of a family clinging to the appearance of wealth it no longer fully possesses, engaged to a man chosen as much for financial necessity as affection. Her early scenes are marked by a kind of suffocation, visually reinforced by tight corsetry, rigid social choreography, and interiors that, however opulent, function as enclosures. Rose's psychological journey is one of reclamation rather than transformation in the simplest sense. The film suggests that the person she becomes by the end is not a new self invented aboard the ship, but a self that was always latent, given permission to surface. Her attraction to Jack is inseparable from her attraction to the freedom he represents. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom to choose her own terms of living. The film is careful, though, not to make Rose merely a vessel for Jack's influence. Her decision-making, including the pivotal choice to walk away from her engagement and her assumed future, is repeatedly staged as her own agency rather than a rescue performed on her by someone else. This distinction matters critically because it separates Titanic from a simpler and more paternalistic version of the same basic story, one in which a male character simply liberates a passive female character. The film is careful to stage Rose's most consequential choices: her initial approach to Jack, her decision to return to the sinking ship after having reached the safety of a lifeboat, her eventual choice to build an entirely different life than the one expected of her. As actions she initiates, even when Jack is present and supportive. Her arc is better understood as one of a person discovering, under extreme circumstances, the extent of her own capacity for decisive action, with Jack functioning as a catalyst and companion for that discovery rather than its sole author. Jack Dawson. Jack is constructed as a figure of narrative and thematic contrast to Rose's world, unencumbered by inherited wealth, defined by mobility rather than status, and possessed of an artist's habit of seeing people as they are rather than as their social position dictates. His psychology is comparatively less layered than Rose's, and this is by design. Jack functions in part as a catalytic figure, someone whose primary narrative purpose is to make Rose's transformation possible. This has drawn some critical commentary about the relative thinness of his interiority compared to hers, a point addressed later in the criticism section. Still, Jack is not without his own coherent worldview. His itinerant life, his comfort with uncertainty, and his instinct toward generosity rather than acquisition all mark him as a character whose values exist in direct opposition to the transactional logic that governs Rose's engagement and her family's social position. Jack's identity as an artist is also worth noting as more than incidental biographical detail. His practice of sketching strangers, capturing them as individuals worth attention regardless of their social station, mirrors and reinforces the film's broader thematic interest in seeing past status to authentic personhood. That he sketches Rose herself in one of the film's most widely referenced sequences is not simply a moment of intimacy but a continuation of this established pattern. Jack's way of relating to the world, expressed consistently through his art from his earliest scenes onward, is to look at people directly and render them as they are, which stands in explicit contrast to the performative, status-conscious way Rose has been seen and treated by nearly everyone else in her life up to that point. Cal Hockley. Cal is frequently discussed as a straightforward antagonist, and the film does not ask audiences to look for much moral complexity in him. But his narrative function deserves more precise description than simple villainy. Cal represents the logic of ownership extended into the realm of relationships. His understanding of Rose is possessive rather than relational, and his cruelty is less about sadism for its own sake than about a worldview in which people, like objects, can be rightfully claimed. This makes him a thematic counterpart to the ship's first-class world more broadly, a world where value is measured by possession and appearance. His actions during the sinking, particularly his willingness to abandon the code of conduct he claims to represent, expose the gap between the performed morality of his class and its actual priorities under pressure. Ruth DeWitt Bukater. Rose's mother is often read reductively as a controlling antagonist, but the film gives her enough shading to suggest a more specific psychological position, a woman whose own security depends entirely on her daughter's marriage, operating within a social system that offers women of her class few alternative paths to financial stability. Her insistence on the engagement to Cal is framed less as personal cruelty than as a kind of desperate pragmatism, shaped by a world that has already foreclosed most of her own options. This does not excuse the harm her choices cause Rose, but it complicates a purely villainous reading and situates her within the same systemic class critique the film applies more broadly. Historical and composite figures. The film populates its edges with figures drawn from the historical record. Captain Edward Smith, designer Thomas Andrews, and the ship's officers among them, rendered with varying degrees of dramatic license. Thomas Andrews in particular is given significant narrative weight as a figure of conscience, a man whose technical understanding of the ship's fate collides with his inability to prevent it, and whose quiet, dutiful demeanor during the disaster stands in contrast to the panic and self-interest displayed elsewhere. These characters function as a bridge between the fictional love story and the historical event, grounding the invented narrative within a recognizable, documented framework. Supporting and minor characters. Beyond its central figures, Titanic populates its world with a number of supporting characters who, though given comparatively little screen time, contribute meaningfully to the film's texture and thematic range. Fabrizio, Jack's traveling companion, provides a warmth and camaraderie that establishes Jack's world as one built on friendship and mutual generosity rather than isolated individualism, reinforcing the contrast between third-class communal warmth and the more transactional, status-conscious relationships depicted in First Class. Molly Brown, drawn from a real historical figure, functions within the fictional narrative as a kind of bridge character, wealthy but not born into her wealth, and consequently more willing than the old money passengers around her to treat Jack with genuine respect rather than condescension. Her presence allows the film to complicate its class critique slightly, suggesting that the rigidity separating the classes is a matter of inherited social convention rather than an immutable law, since a character who has crossed that boundary herself is shown to see through its arbitrariness more clearly than those born on one side of it. Even briefer characters, the ship's officers making decisions under pressure, third-class passengers reacting with fear and confusion to locked gates, the elderly couple who choose to face death together rather than be separated, serve to widen the film's emotional aperture beyond its central romance, ensuring that the disaster registers as a collective human event and not merely as backdrop for two individual fates. This use of a broad supporting cast to distribute emotional weight across many small, vivid moments rather than concentrating it solely in the protagonists is a structural choice with clear roots in the disaster film tradition, and Titanic deploys it with more historical grounding than most films in that genre typically attempt. Thomas Andrews as moral witness. Among the film's historically grounded figures, Thomas Andrews occupies a particularly significant narrative role as a kind of moral witness to the unfolding disaster. As the ship's designer, Andrews possesses technical knowledge that allows him to understand, well before most other characters, both the certainty and the approximate timeline of the ship's sinking. The film uses this knowledge asymmetry to devastating effect, staging several of Andrews's scenes as quiet, controlled explanations of the ship's fate delivered to characters, and by extension to the audience, who must absorb the full weight of that knowledge in real time. His personal conduct during the disaster, marked by continued efforts to help other passengers even after recognizing his own fate is sealed, gives the film one of its clearest embodiments of duty and quiet dignity, offered without the fanfare or heroic framing given to more central characters, which arguably makes it more affecting rather than less. Character purpose within the larger design. Taken together, the film's characters are organized less around individual complexity for its own sake, and more around their function within a larger thematic system contrasting authenticity against performance, and freedom against confinement. Rose's psychological arc is the film's true engine. The other characters are calibrated, with different degrees of nuance, to test, oppose, or illuminate different facets of that arc. This is a legitimate and common structure in character-driven epics, though it does mean that supporting characters sometimes serve thematic function more than they serve as fully autonomous psychological studies in their own right. 6. Themes. Love as liberation. Titanic treats romantic love not primarily as an end in itself, but as a mechanism of personal liberation. The relationship between Jack and Rose is structured so that love becomes the catalyst through which Rose accesses parts of herself that her social world had suppressed. This is a somewhat different thematic proposition than the conventional romantic formula in which two people simply fall in love and the narrative rewards them with union. Here, the relationship's significance lies less in permanence and more in transformation. The film ultimately denies the couple a shared future, which is a meaningful thematic choice. It suggests that love's value in this story is not measured by its duration, but by its capacity to permanently alter the person who experiences it. Freedom versus confinement. Freedom operates throughout the film both literally and figuratively. Literally, the ship's geography enforces confinement through class barriers, locked gates, and assigned decks. Figuratively, Rose's life before Jack is defined by a series of confinements. An engagement she did not choose in any meaningful sense, a mother's expectations, a social calendar that leaves no room for personal desire. Jack, by contrast, embodies unstructured mobility. The film's visual grammar reinforces this contrast consistently, placing Rose in enclosed, ornate spaces early on and gradually moving her into open, exposed spaces, the bow of the ship, the deck under open sky, as her psychological state shifts toward autonomy. Sacrifice. Sacrifice in Titanic operates on both an intimate and a collective scale. On the intimate scale, Jack's choice to ensure Rose's survival at the cost of his own life is the film's central sacrificial act, and it retroactively reframes the entire romance. The relationship was never really about a future together, but about one person's capacity to permanently change another's life through an act of selfless devotion. On the collective scale, the film depicts numerous historically grounded acts of sacrifice. Men stepping back from lifeboats to allow women and children to board, the ship's musicians continuing to play as the vessel sank, crew members remaining at their posts. These moments function as a broader meditation on what human beings choose to do when social structures collapse, and only individual character remains. Social class. Class is arguably the film's most sustained and explicitly developed theme, operating as both social critique and structural device. The ship's physical layout becomes a metaphor made literal. Wealth occupies the upper decks and the safest, most accessible paths to the lifeboats, while poverty occupies the lower decks, both physically and, the film argues, in terms of the disaster's actual mortality outcomes. The romance between Jack and Rose functions as a form of boundary transgression that exposes the arbitrariness and cruelty of these class distinctions, particularly in moments where third-class passengers are shown being physically restrained from accessing the boat deck. The film's class critique is not subtle, and it is not intended to be. It uses melodrama's traditional clarity of moral stakes to make an argument about inherited privilege that would be blunted by more ambiguous treatment. ambition and its costs. Ambition appears in the film in more than one register. There is the ambition embodied by the ship itself, the White Star Line's desire for prestige, the era's broader confidence in engineering as a form of mastery over nature, which the disaster punishes severely. There is also a quieter, more personal register of ambition in characters like Thomas Andrews, whose professional pride in the ship he designed is undercut by the horror of watching his own achievement fail exactly as his calculations predicted it would. The film uses these different scales of ambition to build a coherent argument. That confidence untethered from humility, whether corporate or individual, carries real risk. Fate and mortality. Because the ship's sinking is historically certain, fate operates in Titanic less as a mystery to be resolved, and more as a condition the characters and the audience must learn to live inside. The film's meditation on mortality is handled with unusual directness for a mainstream studio production. It does not shy away from depicting the disaster's human cost in ways that are frightening and often deliberately unglamorous. This directness is thematically purposeful. It insists that the romance, however emotionally central, cannot be extracted from the reality of mass death that surrounds it. The film's emotional power depends in part on refusing to let its audience forget that people actually died in this event, even as it tells an invented story within it. Hope, resilience, and memory. The film's frame narrative, built around Rose's survival and eventual old age, introduces themes of resilience and memory that operate at a different register than the shipboard tragedy itself. Rose's long subsequent life, the choices she implies she made because of what she learned aboard Titanic, suggests that the film's ultimate interest is not only in the disaster, but in what a person does with the time they are given afterward. Memory itself becomes thematized. The film insists that Rose's internal, subjective recollection carries a truth that the treasure hunter's material search for the diamond cannot access, positioning personal memory as more valuable than material or archaeological proof. Gender and autonomy. Closely related to, but distinct from, the film's treatment of freedom generally is its specific interest in gendered autonomy within Edwardian society. Rose's arc is not simply about escaping class constraint in the abstract. It is specifically about escaping the particular set of constraints placed on women of her class and era, whose life paths were expected to run through marriage rather than independent choice, regardless of personal aptitude or desire. The film makes this explicit through Rose's stated ambitions and frustrations, and through the contrast between her constrained circumstances and the far greater latitude, however precarious, available to a working-class woman like Molly Brown or to the more transient, self-directed existence Jack represents. The disaster itself, notably, is depicted as an event that briefly suspends ordinary social protocol. Women and children prioritized over men, social status momentarily subordinated to the ship's chain of command, and the film uses this suspension to expose, by contrast, how thoroughly gender and class ordinarily structure the possibilities available to someone like Rose. Technology and hubris. The film's engagement with the theme of technological overconfidence operates as a kind of historical companion piece to its class critique, applying a similar skepticism toward unearned confidence. In this case, confidence in engineering rather than social status. The ship's reputation for near invincibility, its owners and builders' evident pride in its scale and construction, and the fatal decision to maintain speed through a known ice field despite repeated warnings all dramatize a broader cultural pattern the film is interested in indicting: the tendency of technological achievement to breed a complacency that ignores accumulating evidence of risk. This theme resonates beyond its immediate historical context, functioning as a more general cautionary note about the relationship between engineering confidence and institutional accountability, a theme that has retained clear relevance well beyond the specific circumstances of 1912. Materialism versus authenticity. A quieter but consistent thematic thread throughout Titanic concerns the distinction between value measured materially and value measured through authentic human experience. This tension is dramatized most directly through the contrast between Cal's habit of expressing affection through purchased objects, jewelry chief among them, and Jack's inability to offer anything of material value, which the film treats as incidental rather than as a deficiency. The present-day frame narrative extends this theme into the modern era, contrasting Brock Lovett's initial focus on the diamond's market value with Rose's insistence that the true value of her experience lies in memory and feeling rather than in any object that could be salvaged, appraised, or sold. This theme reaches its clearest statement in the disposal of the diamond into the ocean at the film's close, discussed further in the symbolism section, which functions as the film's final and most direct argument that authentic experience outweighs material possession. The weight of survival. Distinct from the broader theme of hope discussed above, Titanic is also specifically interested in the psychological weight carried by those who survive a catastrophe others did not. The frame narrative's elderly Rose is not depicted as someone who simply moved past the disaster. Her account is presented as something she has carried, largely privately, for the better part of a century, surfacing only in response to the specific prompt of Lovett's expedition. This treatment of survival as an ongoing psychological condition, rather than a discrete event that concludes, cleanly reflects a more sophisticated understanding of trauma and memory than disaster narratives often attempt, and it grounds the film's emotional stakes in something that extends well beyond the immediate crisis aboard the ship, into the entire subsequent shape of a life lived in its aftermath. Duty and the ethics of the uniform, a theme that runs alongside sacrifice but merits distinct attention, concerns duty as an ethical category separate from personal heroism. Characters like the ship's wireless operators, engineering crew, and Thomas Andrews are not depicted as extraordinary heroes in the conventional dramatic sense. They are depicted as ordinary professionals continuing to perform clearly defined roles under conditions of extreme danger, without dramatic speeches or visible bids for recognition. The film treats this quieter form of duty-bound conduct with as much moral seriousness as it treats Jack's more dramatic personal sacrifice, suggesting a layered ethical vision in which both spontaneous, individual acts of love and sustained, unglamorous professional responsibility are given equal narrative respect. This is a subtler thematic achievement than the film's more visible romantic and class themes, but it contributes meaningfully to the moral texture of the disaster sequence as a whole. Identity. Underlying all of the above is a sustained interest in identity as something constructed under social pressure and potentially reclaimed against it. Rose's arc, read through this lens, is a story about the difference between an identity assigned by circumstance, birth, class, gender expectations of the era, and an identity chosen through action. The film's insistence that this reclaimed identity persists across her entire subsequent life, communicated visually and narratively in the frame story, elevates the theme beyond a single romantic episode into a lifelong self-definition. 7. Symbolism. The ocean. The ocean in Titanic functions as more than setting. It operates symbolically as an indifferent, ancient force against which human ambition is measured and, ultimately, humbled. Its vastness dwarfs the ship in early establishing shots, subtly undercutting the era's confidence in the vessel's invincibility before the plot requires it. By the film's end, the same ocean that carried the promise of a new beginning for its passengers becomes the agent of their deaths, and its calm, star-filled stillness in the aftermath. A stillness the film renders almost unbearably peaceful, creates one of the more haunting tonal juxtapositions in mainstream cinema. Catastrophe followed immediately by an indifferent, beautiful silence. The ship itself. Titanic, the vessel, operates as a symbol of the era's technological hubris, but the film complicates this symbolism by also treating the ship as a genuinely magnificent achievement worth admiring, not merely a cautionary object. This duality, awe and warning held simultaneously, mirrors the film's broader refusal to reduce its historical material to simple moralizing. The ship's architecture, moving from opulent upper decks to increasingly utilitarian lower decks, doubles as the film's most consistent visual expression of the class theme discussed above. The heart of the ocean. The fictional diamond that gives the film's contemporary framing device its narrative engine functions symbolically on multiple levels. As an object pursued by Brock Lovett's expedition for its monetary value, it represents the material, transactional way the present-day world initially approaches the Titanic story, as treasure, as a story about loss measured in dollar value. Rose's eventual disposal of the diamond into the ocean at the film's close inverts this logic entirely. It is an act that prioritizes personal meaning and closure over material worth, reinforcing the film's thematic argument that authentic value cannot be measured in the same terms as monetary value. The diamond's name, invoking both romance and permanence, also stands in ironic contrast to its owner's actual conclusion, that the truest treasure of her life was an experience, not an object. The staircase and vertical space. Titanic's grand staircase, along with the film's broader use of vertical space, operates as a recurring visual motif for social ascent and descent, both literal and figurative. Early scenes use the staircase to display social ritual and hierarchy. Later scenes, once the ship begins listing and eventually sinking, invert this vertical geography entirely, turning what had been a symbol of gracious upward movement into a site of desperate, chaotic descent and, eventually, submersion. The film's visual intelligence is evident in how consistently it returns to vertical composition, characters climbing, characters falling, water rising, as a physical enactment of its thematic concerns with class and fate. Doors and thresholds. Doors, gates, and thresholds recur throughout the film as physical manifestations of class boundaries. The gates separating third class from the upper decks, the doors of the ship's compartments, and, in the film's climactic and widely debated final act, the floating wooden panel that becomes Rose's means of survival. This last object has generated significant audience discussion, addressed in the frequently discussed topics section below, but its symbolic function is clear regardless of the debate around its physical plausibility. It is a literal threshold between life and death, and the film's staging of who occupies it and how carries clear narrative weight. Birds and flight. Recurring imagery of flight. Rose's outstretched arms at the ship's bow, framed against open sky, and Jack's repeated invitation for her to feel as though she is flying, functions as the film's most explicit visual metaphor for the freedom theme discussed above. Flight, unlike most of the film's other symbolic imagery, is unambiguously aspirational rather than dual-edged. It represents a state the film treats as unreservedly positive, in contrast to the more morally complicated symbolism attached to wealth, the ship, or even the ocean itself. The image's simplicity is precisely what has made it so culturally durable, functioning as an easily legible shorthand for the film's emotional thesis, even for audiences who have not seen the full film. Water as transformation. Water operates symbolically across the film with a duality that mirrors its symbolic treatment of the ocean more broadly. It is the medium of the disaster's horror, but it is also consistently associated with moments of emotional honesty and transformation, from the rain that accompanies key emotional beats to the final act's literal immersion, which strips away the social markers, clothing, status, composure, that had defined the characters' identities up to that point. By the time the ship is fully submerged, water has effectively erased the physical distinctions of class and status that structured the first half of the film, forcing every character, regardless of social position, into the same immediate, elemental struggle for survival. This symbolic leveling reinforces the film's class critique at a visual and structural level, without requiring further dialogue to make the point explicit. Names and their resonance. The names given to the film's two central fictional characters carry a light but discernible symbolic charge. Rose, evoking natural beauty, growth, and the traditional association of the flower with both delicacy and hidden thorns, suits a character whose apparent fragility within her social world conceals a considerable inner resilience that the narrative gradually reveals. Jack, by contrast, is a plain, unadorned, working-class name, consistent with his narrative function as an everyman figure unburdened by inherited status or pretension. While this kind of naming symbolism should not be overstated as a deliberate, heavily coded literary device, it is consistent with the film's broader tendency, discussed throughout this essay, toward legible, direct symbolic choices suited to its melodramatic register rather than more obscure or ambiguous naming strategies. Music as symbol. Beyond its function as emotional accompaniment, discussed further in the filmmaking section, music operates symbolically within the story itself. The ship's band, playing throughout the disaster and, according to widely reported historical accounts the film draws upon, continuing even as the situation became hopeless, functions within the narrative as a symbol of dignity maintained in the face of chaos, a deliberate contrast to the panic and self-interested behavior displayed elsewhere aboard the ship. The choice of what the band plays in its final moments has taken on its own layer of historical and symbolic significance beyond the film, tied to long-standing public fascination with the actual musicians' reported final performance. And the film's inclusion of this detail reinforces its broader thematic interest in how individuals choose to conduct themselves when social structures collapse and only personal character remains. Light and darkness. The film's cinematography uses light with symbolic intent, particularly in its contrast between the illuminated, warm interiors of the ship's social spaces and the cold, dark exterior of the North Atlantic night. As the disaster progresses, the ship's electric lighting, itself a symbol of modern technological confidence, fails in stages, and the film stages this failure as both a literal plot event and a symbolic collapse of the illusion of human control over the natural world. 8. Filmmaking. Directing. James Cameron's direction of Titanic is characterized by a preference for clarity over ambiguity, both in staging and in emotional intent. Unlike directors who favor elliptical or understated approaches, Cameron consistently ensures that the audience understands exactly what a character wants, fears, or feels at any given moment. This directness is sometimes framed as a limitation by critics who prefer more restrained storytelling, but it is better understood as a deliberate stylistic choice suited to the film's melodramatic mode. Melodrama, as a narrative tradition, depends on legibility of emotion and moral stakes. Cameron's directing choices are consistent with that tradition rather than working against it. Cameron's direction is also notable for its command of scale. Few directors have demonstrated an equal facility for staging both intimate two-person scenes and crowd sequences involving hundreds of extras, practical effects, and complex technical choreography, often within the same sequence. The film's ability to move fluidly between a quiet conversation on the bow and a wide shot of the entire ship's deck in chaos, without a jarring shift in tone or visual coherence, reflects a directorial sensibility comfortable operating at wildly different registers of scale. Cinematography. The film's cinematography, overseen by Russell Carpenter, shifts in style across the film's two halves in a way that reinforces the narrative's own tonal shift. The first half favors warmer color temperatures, more classical, stable compositions, and a visual elegance befitting the ship's opulence and the leisurely pace of the voyage. The second half, once disaster strikes, adopts cooler tones, more dynamic and unstable camera movement, and compositions that emphasize disorientation and scale, wide shots that dwarf individual figures against the enormity of the sinking ship, contrasted with tight, chaotic close-ups during moments of panic. This is cinematography functioning as narrative device rather than mere visual polish. The camera's own behavior communicates the disaster's progression as much as the plot's events do. Editing. The film's editing, by Conrad Buff, James Cameron, and Richard A. Harris, is essential to managing the film's considerable length and tonal range. The first half employs a more patient editing rhythm, allowing scenes to breathe and establishing a sense of leisurely time appropriate to a transatlantic voyage. Once the ship strikes the iceberg, editing rhythm accelerates substantially, with shorter cuts, more parallel action across multiple locations on the ship, and a mounting sense of simultaneity that conveys the disaster's scale without needing to show every individual event in full. The editing also plays a crucial role in the film's frame narrative, using match cuts and visual rhymes between the present-day wreck footage and the historical recreation to bind the two timelines together as a single continuous act of memory rather than two disconnected stories. Production design. The film's production design, led by Peter Lamont, is among its most celebrated technical achievements. The reconstruction of the ship's interiors, from the grand staircase to the first-class dining saloon to the more utilitarian third-class spaces, was undertaken with close reference to surviving historical documentation, resulting in sets whose level of detail supports close, sustained scrutiny rather than merely reading correctly in wide shots. The production design also carries thematic weight, using the escalating opulence of upper-deck spaces and the comparative sparseness of lower-deck spaces to visually encode the film's class critique before a single line of dialogue makes the point explicit. Detail as emotional investment. One aspect of the production design worth singling out is the degree to which detail was applied even to elements unlikely to receive sustained audience attention. China patterns matched to surviving artifacts, wallpaper and carpet designs referenced against period photographs, and the reconstruction of specific fixtures like the grand staircase's ornate glass dome and clock. This level of detail functions less as a display of technical achievement for its own sake, and more as an expression of respect toward the historical event being dramatized. A way of signaling, through sheer accumulated craft, that the filmmakers regarded the ship and its passengers as deserving of serious, careful attention rather than approximate reconstruction in service of spectacle alone. Audiences may not consciously register any individual detail of this kind, but the cumulative effect of this density of accurate detail contributes measurably to the sense of lived-in historical authenticity that underlies the film's emotional believability, discussed earlier in relation to Cameron's broader creative goals. Costumes. Costume design, led by Deborah Lynn Scott, similarly served both authenticity and characterization. Rose's costumes track her psychological arc visually, moving from structured, formal garments that constrain movement toward simpler, less restrictive clothing as her character asserts greater autonomy. The costuming for supporting characters and background extras was researched with comparable rigor, distinguishing class through fabric, silhouette, and color palette in ways consistent with documented Edwardian fashion, reinforcing the film's overall commitment to a lived-in, historically grounded world. Practical effects. Much of Titanic's enduring visual credibility stems from its extensive use of practical effects. The near full-scale ship exterior, functioning water systems capable of flooding sets in a controlled manner, and physical stunt work performed by actors and stunt performers navigating genuinely difficult, often dangerous physical conditions. This commitment to practical filmmaking gives the disaster sequences a tactile weight that has aged notably well compared to films of the same era that relied more heavily on early-generation digital effects. Audiences can sense, even without consciously analyzing it, when water is behaving as real water does under gravity and pressure, and the film's practical foundations account for much of that sensed realism. Visual effects. Where practical effects could not achieve the necessary scale, full exterior shots of the ship at sea, digital crowds populating wide shots of the deck, and the final destruction of the vessel, Titanic relied on visual effects work that was, at the time, at the leading edge of the technology. Digital water simulation, motion capture for crowd behavior, and digital compositing to integrate miniature and full-scale elements into single coherent shots represented significant technical advances. The film's visual effects earned an Academy Award and have been widely cited as influential on subsequent large-scale disaster and effects-driven filmmaking, particularly in the development of digital water and crowd simulation tools used in later films. Sound design. Sound design contributes substantially to the disaster sequence's visceral impact. The groaning stress of the ship's structure, the roar of incoming water, the specific and carefully layered sounds of the ship's mechanical failure. The sound team's work here operates largely below conscious notice, which is itself a mark of its success. Effective sound design in a sequence this chaotic must feel inevitable and unmanufactured, guiding the audience's emotional and physical sense of danger without calling attention to itself as a technical achievement. Performance. The performances at the center of Titanic, particularly those of Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, are essential to the film's ability to sustain its emotional claims across a 3-hour runtime. Winslet's performance carries the heavier interpretive burden, since Rose's psychological transformation is the film's primary emotional through line. Her performance tracks a gradual loosening of physical and emotional restraint across the film, communicated as much through posture, breath, and small physical choices as through dialogue, giving the character's arc a legible interior life beyond what the script alone provides. DiCaprio's performance, working within a role more constrained by its function as catalyst rather than fully autonomous protagonist, compensates for that structural thinness with a naturalistic charisma that makes Jack's appeal to Rose, and to the audience, immediately and convincingly legible without requiring extensive explanatory dialogue. The supporting performances, particularly Billy Zane's calibrated, controlled menace as Cal and Gloria Stewart's performance as the elderly Rose, grounding the entire film's frame narrative in a sense of hard-won, lived experience. round out an ensemble whose collective effectiveness is easy to underrate precisely because it succeeds so completely at making a melodramatic register feel emotionally earned rather than overplayed. Musical score. James Horner's score is among the film's most influential and widely recognized elements, blending orchestral composition with Celtic-influenced instrumentation, including Uilleann pipes and vocal performances, to create a musical identity distinct from typical Hollywood orchestral scoring of the period. The score functions thematically as well as emotionally, using recurring musical motifs to bind the romance, the historical setting, and the disaster into a coherent musical through line. The film's central theme has become so widely recognized that it functions almost independently of the film itself as a piece of cultural shorthand for romantic longing, a rare achievement for a film score of any era. 9. Historical authenticity. What the film gets right. Titanic's physical reconstruction of the ship, its layout, its interior design, the general chronology of the sinking, and the depiction of numerous real, documented events and figures, is grounded in substantial historical research. The film's portrayal of the ship's insufficient lifeboat capacity, the initial disbelief among crew and passengers that the ship was actually sinking, the wireless operators continuing to send distress signals, the band playing to calm passengers, and the broad timeline of the disaster's roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes from collision to sinking are all consistent with the historical record as understood at the time of the film's production. The film's depiction of Captain Edward Smith and designer Thomas Andrews, while dramatized, draws on documented accounts of their conduct during the disaster. The film's treatment of class disparity in survival outcomes is also grounded in historical analysis. Third-class passengers did face structural disadvantages in reaching the boat deck, and survival rates did skew significantly by class and gender, a pattern the film dramatizes clearly through its fictional characters' experiences. Where the film takes artistic liberties. The central romance between Jack and Rose is, of course, entirely fictional, as are the two characters themselves. The film also takes dramatic liberties with some depicted events and figures for narrative effect, condensing timelines, inventing specific confrontations, and, in a few instances, depicting historical figures or generalized groups, such as certain crew members, in ways that have drawn objection from descendants or historians for dramatizing behavior, such as an officer's suicide or specific instances of passengers being forcibly restrained, that is disputed or not fully substantiated by the historical record. These dramatizations should be understood as artistic interpretation built around a real event rather than documentary reconstruction, and the film does not claim otherwise. Its opening explicitly frames the historical footage as real, while the narrative that follows is clearly presented as a personal, subjective account filtered through a fictional survivor. The depiction of crew conduct. One area of historical dramatization that has generated particular sensitivity involves the film's depiction of certain crew members' conduct during the disaster, including a scene implying a specific officer's suicide under the pressure of the unfolding chaos. This portrayal proved controversial with descendants of the historical individual involved, who disputed its accuracy, and the studio issued a public statement acknowledging the fictionalized nature of the scene following the film's release. This episode is a useful case study in the broader tension inherent in historical fiction, dramatizing named, real individuals in scenes not fully corroborated by the historical record carries real consequences for how those individuals and their descendants are remembered, distinct from the more generalized dramatic license the film takes with invented characters. It represents one of the more legitimate and specific critiques of the film's handling of historical material, separate from the broader and more defensible dramatic compressions and simplifications discussed elsewhere in this section. Production decisions in the service of narrative. Certain production decisions, compressing the chronology of specific events, combining or simplifying some historical details, and emphasizing particular passengers' experiences over others, reflect the practical necessity of building a coherent 3-hour narrative out of an event whose full historical complexity would require far more time to represent comprehensively. These are reasonable and common choices for historical drama, provided the audience understands, as the film's framing invites them to, that they are watching an emotionally truthful interpretation rather than an exhaustive record. Real historical figures. The film includes numerous figures drawn directly from history, in addition to Smith and Andrews, including wireless operators, ship's officers, and, in brief appearances, passengers who were real historical figures such as Molly Brown and members of the Astor family, though their portrayals are dramatized rather than documentary. The presence of these real figures alongside entirely fictional characters like Jack and Rose creates a blended historical-fictional texture that is common in historical epics, but worth noting explicitly as a genre convention, rather than a claim to strict factual accuracy in every depicted interaction. The wireless room and distress communication. The film's depiction of the ship's wireless operators, continuing to transmit distress calls as conditions aboard deteriorated, reflects one of the better documented aspects of the historical disaster, and one the film handles with particular fidelity. The historical record establishes that wireless communication played a decisive role both in the disaster's unfolding, including a nearby ship's radio operator having gone off duty shortly before the collision, delaying that vessel's awareness of the emergency, and in the eventual rescue of survivors by the Carpathia, whose wireless operator remained alert to Titanic's distress signal. The film's attention to this technical and procedural detail, rather than treating the rescue as a matter of simple good fortune, reflects Cameron's broader commitment, discussed in the section on his creative vision, to grounding even the disaster's resolution in documented historical mechanics rather than dramatic convenience alone. A balanced perspective. Taken as a whole, Titanic achieves an unusually high degree of physical and chronological accuracy for a mainstream studio film built around a fictional romance, while still taking the dramatic liberties necessary to tell that romance effectively. The film is best understood not as a historical document, but as a piece of historical fiction that treats its factual foundation with considerable respect, while reserving its most significant fictional latitude for the invented characters and relationships layered on top of that foundation. Viewers seeking a comprehensive factual account of the disaster are better served by documentary treatments of the event. Viewers seeking an emotionally resonant dramatization built on a historically researched foundation are well served by Cameron's film. 10. Emotional impact. Universal emotional architecture. Titanic's emotional power derives significantly from its reliance on universally legible emotional structures, rather than culturally or historically specific ones. The desire for freedom against constraint, the fear of losing someone to circumstances beyond one's control, the grief of survival when others are lost, and the longing for a love that shaped a life even after it ended. These are emotional experiences that do not require historical or cultural context to understand. The film's historical setting provides texture and stakes, but its emotional core is built from experiences that translate readily across audiences with very different relationships to the actual history of 1912. Empathy through structural design. The film builds empathy deliberately and incrementally. By spending significant time in the first half establishing Jack and Rose as individuals with clear desires and clear obstacles before the disaster begins, the film ensures that by the time catastrophe strikes, the audience is invested in these two people as individuals rather than as abstract stand-ins for victims. This is a crucial distinction. Disaster narratives that rush toward spectacle often struggle to generate genuine grief because the audience has not been given sufficient time to care about specific individuals. Titanic's patient first half is, in this sense, functioning as emotional infrastructure for everything that follows. Suspense rooted in character, not plot mechanics. As discussed in the storytelling section, the film's suspense operates primarily at the level of character outcome rather than plot mechanics, since the plot's central mechanic, the ship sinking, is never in doubt. This means the film's suspense is almost entirely emotional. Will these specific people I have come to care about survive? And if not, how will they face what is coming? This kind of suspense tends to produce a different, often more lasting, emotional response than plot-based suspense, because it does not resolve and disappear once the mechanical outcome is revealed. It lingers in the audience's memory of how characters behaved under extremity. Tragedy and catharsis. The film's tragic elements are handled with a directness that allows for genuine catharsis rather than manipulative sentimentality, though this is a point of some critical disagreement addressed in the criticism section. The film does not shy away from depicting the disaster's horror, passengers freezing in the water, the chaos of the lifeboat loading, the ship's structural failure. And this directness earns the emotional release that follows, because the audience has been made to feel the weight of what was lost, rather than having it gestured at abstractly. Romance as an amplifier of loss. The romantic relationship at the film's center functions, emotionally, as an amplifying lens for the historical tragedy, rather than a distraction from it. By attaching the audience's emotional investment to two specific individuals whose fates are bound up with a larger disaster, the film makes the scale of the historical loss more legible on a human scale. It is easier for most audiences to grieve two people whose hopes and personalities they have come to know intimately than to grieve an abstract number of historical dead, however genuinely tragic that number is. This is not a criticism of the film's approach, but an observation about how narrative fiction often succeeds in making large-scale tragedy emotionally accessible, through specific, individualized human stories. Class-conscious grief. The film's emotional impact is also shaped by its refusal to let the audience grieve only for its central couple. By repeatedly cutting away, during the disaster sequence, to third-class passengers trapped behind locked gates, to families separated by lifeboat protocols, and to the disparity in outcomes between the ship's wealthiest and poorest passengers, the film ensures that its emotional register carries an undertone of anger and injustice alongside grief. This is a deliberate choice consistent with the class theme discussed earlier. The tragedy the film asks audiences to feel is not simply the tragedy of nature's indifference or fate's cruelty, but specifically the tragedy of a disaster whose human toll was significantly worsened by preventable structural inequality. This dual register, mourning what was lost while also recognizing that some of what was lost need not have been, gives the film's emotional impact a moral dimension that purely apolitical disaster narratives typically lack. Physical realism and visceral fear. Part of Titanic's emotional impact stems from a register distinct from grief or romantic longing, a more primal, physical fear generated by its unusually direct depiction of the mechanics of drowning, cold water immersion, and physical panic. The film does not abstract or soften these elements. Its depiction of passengers struggling in freezing water, of the ship's interior flooding and trapping people within it, and of the physical chaos of a mass panic aboard a rapidly listing vessel is staged with a level of visceral, bodily specificity that produces genuine physiological tension in the audience, distinct from the more purely emotional responses generated by the character-driven material discussed elsewhere in this section. This visceral dimension matters because it prevents the film's back half from becoming purely melancholic. It keeps the audience in a state of active, embodied concern for the character's physical survival, which sharpens rather than dilutes the emotional stakes of the romance unfolding alongside it. Human relationships beyond the central romance. The film's emotional impact also draws on its depiction of relationships beyond the central romance. An elderly couple choosing to remain together in bed as the water rises, a mother telling her children a bedtime story to shield them from fear, crew members and musicians fulfilling their roles even in the face of certain death. These moments, several grounded in historical accounts, broaden the film's emotional scope beyond its central couple and remind the audience that the disaster's tragedy was collective, made up of thousands of individual, unrecorded acts of love, duty, and fear. Grief across changing audiences. One notable feature of Titanic's emotional design is how consistently it has produced strong responses across audiences with very different relationships to the historical event it depicts. Viewers who came of age with living memory or close family connection to the disaster's era experienced the film against one emotional backdrop. Viewers born decades after its release, for whom 1912 is as historically distant as the 19th century, experience it against another. That the film's emotional mechanisms continue to function effectively across this widening historical distance suggests that its emotional design, discussed throughout this section, is genuinely well constructed rather than dependent on audiences bringing pre-existing emotional investment in the historical event itself. The grief the film generates is manufactured, in the best sense of that word, by craft, character development, pacing, sound, and music working together, rather than borrowed wholesale from the audience's prior relationship to the Titanic disaster as history. The aftermath as an extended exhale. The film's treatment of the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the eerily calm, star-filled ocean surface, the scattered lifeboats, the silence following the ship's disappearance, and the arrival of rescue, functions as a deliberate tonal counterweight to the frenetic chaos of the sinking sequence that precedes it. Rather than cutting quickly away from the disaster once the ship disappears beneath the surface, the film lingers in this aftermath, allowing the audience the emotional space to process what has just been depicted before the narrative moves toward its resolution. This pacing choice reflects a sophisticated understanding of emotional pacing. A story that moved directly from maximum chaos to narrative closure without this intervening period of stillness would risk denying the audience the processing time that grief, even fictional grief experienced through a screen, generally requires to register fully. 11. Cultural legacy. Critical reception. Titanic received largely positive reviews upon release, with widespread praise for its technical achievements, its visual spectacle, and its emotional effectiveness, alongside some critical reservations about its dialogue and its central romance's relative simplicity compared to the sophistication of its production values. This division in critical response, enormous respect for craft paired with more mixed assessments of the screenplay, has remained a fairly consistent through line in how the film is discussed critically in the decades since, and it is a division this essay engages with directly in the criticism section. Awards. The film was nominated for 14 Academy Awards and won 11, tying the then record for most Oscars won by a single film, a record it would later share with Ben-Hur and, subsequently, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Its wins spanned both craft categories: cinematography, visual effects, sound, editing, costume design, production design, original score, original song, and the top categories of Best Director and Best Picture. This breadth of recognition, covering nearly every technical and creative department involved in the film's production, reflects an unusually broad industry consensus about the film's achievement across multiple disciplines simultaneously, rather than success concentrated in one or two areas. Box office and commercial impact. Titanic became the highest-grossing film in history at the time of its release, a position it held for over a decade until Cameron's own Avatar surpassed it. Its commercial performance was particularly notable for its unusual longevity in theaters, sustained substantially by repeat viewership rather than a single opening surge followed by rapid decline, a pattern that reflected the depth of audience attachment to the film rather than simple curiosity-driven attendance. Influence on filmmaking. The film's technical innovations in digital water simulation, large-scale visual effects integration, and the blending of practical and digital filmmaking techniques influenced subsequent big-budget productions, particularly in the disaster and epic genres. Its commercial success also had an industry-wide effect on how studios approached large-budget filmmaking more broadly, demonstrating that sufficiently ambitious production values combined with emotionally resonant storytelling could justify historically unprecedented budgets, a lesson subsequent studio decision-making absorbed, for better and occasionally for worse, in the blockbuster era that followed. Global popularity. Titanic's commercial and cultural success was notably global rather than concentrated in North American or English-language markets, with the film performing exceptionally well across a wide range of international territories. This global reach contributed to its status as a genuinely cross-cultural phenomenon, and the film's themes, class, love, mortality, freedom, proved legible and resonant across cultural contexts far removed from Edwardian Britain or America, a testament to the universality of its core emotional architecture discussed in the previous section. Continued relevance. The film has remained a consistent presence in popular culture in the decades since its release, sustained by television broadcasts, home media, streaming availability, and periodic theatrical re-releases, including releases timed to anniversaries of the film and of the historical disaster itself. Its imagery, music, and specific moments remain widely recognized reference points across generations, including among viewers born after the film's original release, indicating a cultural persistence that extends beyond simple nostalgia among its original audience. Impact on popular culture. Beyond the film industry itself, Titanic has left a durable mark on broader popular culture. Its central theme song became one of the best-selling singles of its era. Specific images and lines have become widely recognized cultural shorthand, and the film contributed to a broader renewed public interest in the historical Titanic disaster itself, boosting museum attendance, historical publishing, and public engagement with maritime history more broadly. This ripple effect, a work of historical fiction generating renewed interest in the actual historical record it was based on, is a notable and relatively unusual form of cultural impact for a mainstream feature film. Influence on subsequent romantic and epic filmmaking. Beyond its technical influence on visual effects, discussed earlier, Titanic had a discernible influence on how subsequent studio filmmaking approached the combination of large-scale historical spectacle with intimate romantic narrative. A number of historical epics and disaster films released in the years following Titanic adopted structurally similar approaches, pairing meticulous large-scale production design and effects work with a comparatively small-scale, character-focused emotional core, following the template Titanic demonstrated could achieve both critical respect and enormous commercial success simultaneously. Not all of these subsequent films achieved a comparable balance, which itself underscores how difficult Titanic's particular synthesis actually was to replicate, and how much of its success depended on the specific quality of execution across every department examined in this essay, rather than on the template alone. A shared generational touchstone. For the generation of moviegoers who experienced Titanic during its original, unusually extended theatrical run, the film functions as a genuine shared cultural touchstone in a way relatively few subsequent films have replicated, a status reinforced by the sheer number of people who saw the film multiple times in theaters during that run. This kind of communal, repeat-viewing theatrical experience, sustained over many months rather than concentrated in a single opening weekend, produced a depth of collective cultural memory around the film that later, more fragmented media consumption patterns have made harder for subsequent films to achieve, even those with comparable or greater box office totals. This particular quality of Titanic's original reception, less a single event than an extended communal ritual, is itself part of what distinguishes its legacy from other commercially successful films of its era. Fashion, design, and commercial influence. Titanic's success generated notable secondary cultural effects beyond direct box office and awards recognition, including renewed popular interest in Edwardian-era fashion and design aesthetics, a wave of Titanic-themed merchandise, exhibitions, and traveling artifact displays, and increased tourism to sites connected to the ship's history, including Belfast shipyards and Southampton's departure port. This kind of secondary commercial and cultural ripple effect, in which a film's success generates interest and economic activity well beyond the film industry itself, is relatively unusual in scale, and is a further indicator of how thoroughly the film penetrated public consciousness beyond its immediate audience of moviegoers. Retrospective and academic reassessment. In the years following its release, Titanic has become a recurring subject of academic and critical reassessment within film studies, media studies, and cultural history, examined through lenses including gender studies, class analysis, disaster narrative theory, and the study of blockbuster economics. This scholarly attention marks a notable shift from the film's initial critical reception, which, while largely positive, tended to focus more on box office achievement and technical spectacle than on sustained thematic or formal analysis. The film's subsequent treatment as a legitimate object of academic study, rather than purely a commercial phenomenon, reflects a broader and fairly common pattern in film history, in which works initially received primarily as entertainment gain critical and scholarly stature once the immediate context of their commercial reception recedes, and their formal and thematic achievements can be evaluated with greater distance. Cameron's broader directorial legacy. Titanic's success is also worth situating within James Cameron's broader career, since it established a template he would return to over a decade later with Avatar. Enormous budgets justified by genuine technical innovation, a willingness to delay release until effects technology could meet his ambitions, and a narrative core built on comparatively simple, universally legible, emotional, and thematic material carried by extraordinary production scale. The fact that Titanic held the record for highest-grossing film of all time until Cameron's own subsequent film surpassed it is a notable detail in film history, suggesting that Cameron's particular combination of technical ambition and emotionally direct storytelling represents a genuinely repeatable formula for large-scale audience engagement, rather than a one-time convergence of favorable circumstances. This continuity across Cameron's career retroactively strengthens the case that Titanic's success reflected deliberate, transferable directorial method rather than accident. 12. Frequently discussed topics. The floating door debate. Perhaps no single element of Titanic has generated more sustained public discussion than the question of whether Jack could have survived by sharing the floating wooden panel with Rose in the film's climactic scene. This debate has taken on a life of its own well beyond ordinary film criticism, involving physics-based analyses of buoyancy, informal experiments, and public commentary from the filmmakers themselves addressing the question directly in interviews years after the film's release. From a purely narrative standpoint, the scene's function is not primarily about buoyancy physics. It is about staging a sacrifice that completes Jack's characterization and Rose's transformation. Whether or not the panel could have physically supported both characters is, in this sense, somewhat beside the point dramatically, even though the debate's persistence says something interesting about how deeply audiences have engaged with the film's smallest details, a level of scrutiny usually reserved for events audiences believe actually could have gone differently, which is itself a testament to how emotionally invested audiences became in these fictional characters' fates. Historical accuracy versus dramatic license. As discussed in the historical authenticity section, ongoing public conversation about which elements of the film are historically accurate and which are invented reflects the film's unusual position at the intersection of documentary-level physical reconstruction and entirely fictional central characters. This tension is a natural and largely productive one. It has prompted many viewers to seek out further reading and documentary material about the actual disaster, extending the film's cultural function beyond entertainment into a gateway toward genuine historical interest. Fictional versus real characters. Related to the accuracy debate is ongoing audience curiosity about which characters in the film were real historical figures and which were invented for the story. This question reflects the film's deliberate blending of the two categories discussed above, and continues to generate discussion, particularly as new generations of viewers encounter the film without the surrounding cultural context that existed at the time of its original release, when the distinction was more widely understood by general audiences already familiar with recent press coverage of the production's research. The film's ending. The ending, Rose's death implied through the dreamlike final sequence returning her to the ship, reunited with Jack and applauded by the ship's passengers and crew, has generated interpretive discussion about whether this sequence should be read literally, as an afterlife reunion, or symbolically, as a representation of Rose's internal peace and the emotional completion of her life's arc. The ambiguity is likely intentional, allowing the film to close on a note of emotional resolution without committing to a specific metaphysical claim, a choice consistent with the film's broader interest in memory and subjective emotional truth over literal, objective narration. Whether a shared future was ever possible. A related strand of audience discussion, distinct from the door debate's physics but adjacent to it thematically, concerns whether Jack and Rose's relationship, had the disaster not intervened, could plausibly have endured given the vast social and economic gulf separating them. This discussion engages directly with the film's class theme discussed earlier. Some viewers read the relationship's cutting short by tragedy as narratively convenient, sparing the film from having to depict the practical difficulties such a relationship would likely have faced in the class-conscious world of 1912. Others read the tragic ending as thematically appropriate specifically because it preserves the relationship's transformative value without subjecting it to the corrosive test of practical survival within a social system. The film has spent its entire runtime establishing as hostile to exactly this kind of boundary-crossing union. Both readings find reasonable support in the text, and the film's ambiguity on this specific question, leaving the counterfactual unexplored rather than resolving it definitively, appears to be an intentional choice consistent with its broader interest in memory and emotional truth over tidy narrative resolution. Enduring popularity. Audiences and critics alike continue to discuss why Titanic has remained so persistently popular relative to other films of comparable commercial success from the same era, many of which have faded substantially from cultural conversation. Explanations offered across critical and popular discourse have included the film's technical durability. It has aged unusually well visually compared to contemporaries, its universal thematic content, its status as a genuine communal cultural experience for the generation that saw it during its original theatrical run, and the ongoing real-world fascination with the historical Titanic disaster itself, which the film both draws on and reinforces. This essay's final sections engage with this question directly and in more depth. Comparisons to other disaster and historical films. Titanic is frequently discussed in comparison to other entries in the disaster film genre, as well as to other historical romances, and much of this discussion centers on what distinguishes it from its genre peers. Unlike many disaster films, which tend to distribute attention across an ensemble of characters with comparatively shallow individual development in service of spectacle, Titanic concentrates its character development heavily in two central figures before broadening outward. This structural difference is frequently cited as an explanation for why the film achieves a level of emotional engagement that many disaster films, however impressive their technical spectacle, do not consistently reach. Comparisons to other historical romances, meanwhile, often focus on the unusual scale of historical stakes Titanic attaches to its central relationship, since the romance is not merely set during a significant historical period, but is causally entangled with a real, well-known catastrophe in a way that raises the dramatic consequences considerably beyond those of a typical period romance. 13. Criticisms. Dialogue. The most consistently raised criticism of Titanic concerns its dialogue, particularly in scenes of direct emotional confrontation, where some critics have argued that the writing favors clear statement over subtlety. Lines expressing Rose's sense of entrapment or Jack's philosophy of living freely are, in places, delivered with a directness that can read as expository rather than naturalistic. This criticism has some validity when the film is judged against the standards of more restrained, dialogue-driven dramas. It is worth noting, however, that the film operates within the melodramatic tradition, a mode of storytelling with its own long history and its own standards, in which direct emotional articulation is a feature rather than a flaw. Judged by melodrama's own conventions, much of the dialogue functions effectively. Judged by the conventions of psychological realism, it can feel overstated. Both readings have merit, and the disagreement between them accounts for much of the persistent critical division around the film's writing. Character depth disparities. As noted in the character analysis section, Jack Dawson is frequently criticized as comparatively underwritten relative to Rose, functioning more as a catalyst for her transformation than as a fully autonomous character with his own developed interiority. This criticism is largely fair as a structural observation, though it is worth noting that this kind of asymmetry is a known pattern in stories built around one character's transformation, where a second character exists partly in service of that arc. Whether this is a flaw depends on what one expects from the film. As a rose-centered Bildungsroman using Jack as catalyst, the asymmetry is structurally coherent. As a story of two equally weighted romantic leads, it is a legitimate shortfall. Runtime and pacing concerns. Some critics, both at release and since, have argued that the film's roughly 3-hour runtime is longer than its story strictly requires, particularly citing the unhurried first half as an area that could have been tightened without significant narrative loss. This is a reasonable critical position, though, as discussed in the storytelling analysis section, the patient first half serves a specific structural purpose in building the emotional investment necessary for the second half's impact. Whether that purpose justifies the runtime is ultimately a matter of individual critical judgment rather than an objective failing, though it remains a fair point of contention. Sentimentality. Critics skeptical of the film have sometimes characterized its emotional approach as excessively sentimental, arguing that its combination of sweeping score, direct dialogue, and unambiguous moral framing, particularly regarding Cal's villainy, sacrifices nuance for emotional effect. This criticism intersects with the dialogue critique above, and reflects a broader aesthetic disagreement about melodrama as a mode. What one critic experiences as manipulative sentimentality, another experiences as effective, purposeful emotional engineering operating within an established and legitimate genre tradition. Neither position is simply wrong. They reflect different critical priorities regarding subtlety versus directness in emotional storytelling. Simplification of historical complexity. Some historians and critics have raised concerns about the film's simplification of certain historical elements, its handling of specific crew members' documented or disputed conduct, its condensation of the disaster's timeline, and its use of composite or altered characterizations for dramatic effect. These concerns are legitimate within the context of historical criticism, though, as discussed in the historical authenticity section, the film does not present itself as a documentary, and its narrative frame explicitly signals its fictional, subjective nature. The fairer critical question is not whether the film simplifies history, nearly all historical fiction does, but whether its simplifications distort the disaster's essential character in ways that mislead audiences about its fundamental nature. On this stricter standard, the film's simplifications are largely defensible, even where individual details are dramatized or invented. Moral simplicity in characterization. Related to, but distinct from, the sentimentality critique is a more specific objection to the film's tendency toward unambiguous moral coding, particularly in its treatment of Cal as a villain with little redeeming complexity, and its correspondingly uncomplicated treatment of Jack as a figure of nearly unblemished virtue. Critics have argued that this moral clarity, while effective for generating clear emotional allegiance, forecloses the more ambiguous, ethically layered characterization found in films that resist such clean divisions between admirable and unadmirable characters. This is a legitimate critical observation, though it is worth noting, as with the dialogue and sentimentality critiques above, that clean moral architecture is a standard and long-established feature of melodrama as a mode, in which villains and heroes often function partly as embodiments of opposing social or moral forces, rather than as fully naturalistic individuals. Whether this moral clarity constitutes a weakness depends significantly on what expectations a viewer brings to the film's genre. Cultural overexposure. A more recent and somewhat different form of criticism concerns the film's own cultural ubiquity. Its imagery, music, and specific lines have been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture, parody, and commercial reference that some viewers, particularly those encountering the film for the first time long after its release, struggle to experience it without the mediating effect of decades of cultural repetition. This is not a criticism of the film's craft so much as an observation about the challenges of engaging freshly with any work that has become this culturally saturated, a challenge shared by other landmark films whose most famous elements have become detached, in public memory, from their original dramatic context. Score and song overexposure. A more specific variant of the cultural overexposure criticism concerns the film's theme song and central musical motif, whose extraordinary commercial success and subsequent ubiquity in radio play, television, and popular parody has, for some listeners, diminished the music's original emotional impact within the context of the film itself. This is a somewhat unusual criticism in that it does not fault the music's original composition or its function within the film, but rather the consequences of its own success. A piece of music so widely disseminated outside its original context can become difficult to experience with the same emotional freshness it carried on first exposure. This dynamic is not unique to Titanic, but the scale of the song's crossover success makes the effect more pronounced here than in most comparable cases, and it represents a genuine, if somewhat paradoxical, cost of the film's own cultural triumph. A balanced assessment. Taken together, these criticisms are, for the most part, legitimate and worth taking seriously rather than dismissing reflexively in defense of the film's popularity. At the same time, many of them stem from applying standards drawn from a different mode of filmmaking: psychological realism, restrained dialogue, historical documentary precision, to a film operating deliberately within the conventions of melodrama and historical epic. A fair critical assessment of Titanic should weigh its achievements and shortcomings within the context of the tradition it is actually working in, rather than measuring it solely against traditions it never claimed to belong to. 14. Why Titanic endures. A story built for repeat engagement. Titanic's narrative structure, as discussed throughout this essay, is unusually well suited to repeat viewing. Because its suspense is rooted in character and emotion, rather than plot mechanics that lose their power once revealed, the film does not diminish in impact the way plot twist-dependent films often do after a first viewing. Each subsequent viewing allows the audience to attend more closely to craft, performance detail, visual composition, the layered use of symbolism, rather than simply tracking plot information, which sustains engagement across decades in a way that many equally successful contemporaries have not managed. Technical durability. Unlike many effects-driven films of its era, Titanic's heavy reliance on practical sets, physical stunt work, and water effects has allowed it to age with unusual visual credibility. Films of the late 1990s that relied more heavily on early computer-generated imagery for their central spectacle have often aged less gracefully, as the limitations of period-specific digital technology become more visible with time. Titanic's hybrid approach, favoring practical solutions wherever feasible, has insulated it somewhat from this particular form of technological obsolescence, allowing new generations of viewers to encounter the film's spectacle without the visual friction that can accompany older, more digitally dependent effects work. Intergenerational transmission. The film's continued relevance is sustained substantially by intergenerational transmission. Viewers who experienced the film during its original theatrical run have introduced it to younger family members, and its wide availability across successive home media formats and streaming platforms has ensured continuous accessibility across changing technology. This pattern of transmission, parents sharing a formative cinematic experience with children, who then form their own independent attachment to the film, has helped sustain an audience for the film that extends well beyond its original release cohort. The persistence of its central questions. The thematic questions Titanic engages with: what does authentic freedom look like? What is owed to another person in an act of love? How does class structure shape who survives crisis? What does it mean to have lived a life fully? Do not resolve or expire with time. These are recurring human questions that each generation encounters anew, and a film that engages with them clearly and emotionally accessibly retains relevance regardless of shifts in cultural context, technology, or cinematic fashion. This is a significant part of why Titanic has not become merely a period curiosity, the way some equally successful but more culturally specific films of its era have. The real disaster's ongoing cultural weight. Because Titanic, the film, is built on top of Titanic, the historical event, its cultural staying power is partly borrowed from, and reinforces, the ongoing fascination the public holds for the actual disaster. Anniversaries of the sinking, continued archaeological and historical research on the wreck, and periodic renewed media coverage all provide recurring opportunities for public re-engagement with the film alongside the history it dramatizes. This symbiotic relationship between the historical event's enduring cultural weight and the film's dramatization of it has proven mutually reinforcing in a way that purely fictional blockbusters of the same era have not been able to replicate. A story that rewards different ages differently. Part of Titanic's durability across a viewer's lifetime stems from the fact that different elements of the film tend to resonate most strongly at different stages of life. Younger viewers often connect most immediately with the romance's intensity and the thrill of forbidden connection across class lines. Viewers who revisit the film later in life, having accumulated their own experience of loss, compromise, and the passage of time, often find themselves responding more strongly to the frame narrative's meditation on memory, on a long life lived in the aftermath of a formative event, and on what it means to look back across decades at a single transformative experience. This capacity to offer a meaningfully different emotional experience at different life stages, rather than simply the same experience diminished by familiarity, is a significant and somewhat underappreciated component of why the film continues to be revisited rather than merely remembered. Renewed theatrical life. Titanic's periodic theatrical re-releases, including a 3D conversion released to coincide with the disaster's centennial anniversary, have played a meaningful role in sustaining the film's cultural presence across formats and generations. These re-releases have allowed audiences too young to have seen the film during its original run to experience it as a theatrical event, rather than solely through home viewing, replicating something closer to the communal viewing experience that characterized the film's original cultural impact. This pattern of renewed theatrical engagement, tied to historically meaningful anniversaries of the actual disaster, further reinforces the symbiotic relationship between the film's ongoing cultural relevance and the enduring public fascination with the historical event it dramatizes, discussed earlier in this section. A benchmark for what big-budget filmmaking can achieve. Finally, Titanic endures in part because it continues to function as an implicit benchmark against which subsequent large-scale studio filmmaking is measured, whether consciously or not. Its combination of commercial success, technical achievement, and sustained emotional and critical regard set a standard that relatively few films of comparable budget and ambition have matched in the years since. This benchmark status keeps the film in ongoing critical conversation, even in discussions that are not directly about Titanic itself. Comparisons to it recur regularly in analyses of subsequent blockbusters, disaster films, and historical epics, which has the secondary effect of keeping the film itself continuously present in critical and popular discourse, long after its initial release window closed. A complete emotional experience. Perhaps most fundamentally, Titanic endures because it delivers a complete, self-contained emotional experience within a single viewing. Romance, tragedy, spectacle, historical gravity, and resolution, without requiring familiarity with prior films, extended universes, or supplementary material. In an entertainment landscape increasingly organized around franchises, sequels, and interconnected media, Titanic's status as a fully self-sufficient standalone experience gives it a particular kind of accessibility and closure that has become comparatively rare, and that rarity may itself contribute to its ongoing appeal. 15. Final evaluation. Titanic succeeds, ultimately, because it commits fully to an ambitious and genuinely difficult creative proposition, telling an intimate, invented love story with complete sincerity inside one of the best documented disasters in modern history, without allowing either element to diminish the other. This is a harder balancing act than it might appear from the outside. Films that attempt to combine spectacle and intimacy frequently let one overwhelm the other. The human story becomes an excuse for effect sequences, or the effect sequences feel like an intrusion on the human story. Titanic's achievement is that its craft, at nearly every level examined in this essay, works in service of holding these two elements in genuine balance. The meticulous historical reconstruction exists to make the fictional romance feel consequential and real, and the romance exists to make the historical tragedy legible on a human scale audiences can actually grieve. The film's artistic importance rests substantially on this structural achievement, reinforced by genuinely significant technical innovation in visual effects and practical filmmaking that expanded what was considered achievable in large-scale studio production, and by performances and directorial choices that, whatever their debated merits in matters of subtlety, succeed unambiguously in their intended purpose of generating deep audience investment. Its historical importance lies in its unusually serious engagement with a real catastrophe, treating that catastrophe's human cost with a gravity that elevates the film beyond simple spectacle, even as it takes the dramatic liberties necessary to build a coherent fictional narrative within it. Its cultural importance is evident in the sheer scale and persistence of its impact. Box office records, awards recognition spanning nearly every technical and creative discipline of filmmaking, and a continued presence in popular culture and public conversation across more than a quarter century, sustained not merely by nostalgia but by ongoing new audience engagement. None of this requires treating Titanic as beyond criticism. Its dialogue is, in places, more direct than subtle. Its central male character is thinner than its central female character. Its runtime asks a great deal of patience from its audience before delivering its full emotional payoff, and its treatment of certain historical details simplifies complexity that a documentary treatment would need to preserve. These are real and reasonable points of critical engagement, not merely quibbles to be waved away by appeals to the film's popularity. But a film's greatness has never depended on the absence of legitimate criticism. It depends on whether its ambitions were sufficiently significant and whether its execution, on balance, achieved them. By that standard, Titanic stands as a landmark, a film that took on an unusually difficult set of creative, technical, and historical challenges simultaneously, and that met enough of those challenges with sufficient skill and emotional conviction to become not simply a successful film of its moment, but a work that continues, decades later, to shape how audiences understand what a film can accomplish when spectacle and intimacy, history and invention, are made to serve one another rather than compete. It is worth returning, in closing, to the specific creative problem this essay identified at the outset. How does a filmmaker tell an intimate story whose ending every audience member already knows, inside an event that claimed over 1,500 real lives, without either trivializing the history or letting the history overwhelm the human story built within it? Titanic's answer, examined across every dimension of this essay, its historical research, its structural use of memory and frame narrative, its psychologically coherent central performance, its symbolic and thematic architecture, its technical innovation, and its unflinching emotional directness, was to refuse the premise that these elements were in tension at all. Historical fidelity, in Cameron's hands, became the foundation that made the fictional romance credible. The romance, in turn, became the lens that made the historical tragedy emotionally accessible on a human scale. Neither element was sacrificed for the other, and it is precisely this refusal to choose between spectacle and intimacy that accounts for the film's singular and lasting achievement. Whatever changes in cinematic fashion, technology, and critical taste the coming decades bring, Titanic's core accomplishment is unlikely to diminish in significance. It demonstrated, at a scale rarely attempted before or matched since, that a mainstream studio film could honor real historical tragedy, achieve genuine technical innovation, and still move audiences to tears through the fate of two entirely invented people, and that these were not competing goals, but a single, unified creative achievement.